dear listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Film Filter. This is episode 4, and I am, and remain, Edgar Chaput, the host. About a month ago, I want to say, we were sort of much more firmly implanted in the summer, and I went on a run because I enjoy jogging, very much so in fact, and I kind of have my rhythm when I run. I can almost fully concentrate on podcasts. Some people like music. I prefer podcasts. When I run specifically, I'm not suggesting I don't like music. And a particular podcast I liked, which funnily enough actually concentrates much more so on wristwatches than anything else, but they do once in a while release a film discussion episode. They try to relate it to wristwatches sometimes, but the connection is more tangential. It just so happens the hosts love movies. And they were reviewing Mad Max Fury Road. They heaped a lot of praise on it, and one of the things they highlighted was how that film is mostly one long chase, which is a fairly accurate 2-second description of that movie. And throughout that discussion, they alluded to Buster Keaton, and more specifically his 1926 epic, big-budget epic for the time, The General. And that struck me. I enjoy Mad Max Fury Road very much, so any film that can be compared to it will pique my curiosity. And it was also an excellent excuse to finally watch a bit of Buster Keaton's oeuvre, which I had never seen. I had never seen a single Buster Keaton film. To this day, I still haven't seen any Charlie Chaplin. I think you know where I'm going with this. We're going back to the very, very early days when the American film industry was still quite youthful, and the silent era. And I want to discuss about just my initial thoughts, impressions, and how in some ways what we consume today as movie lovers, as film aficionados, originated in that silent era. It's quite fascinating, and how sometimes very different styles from very different directors in different parts of the globe, sometimes silent films talk to one another. Let's discuss. So I did start with The General. This is a good month ago at this point, and frankly, I was aghast at what I saw. I was slack-jawed, as some might say. I, of course, was aware of the name Buster Keaton, actually born Joseph Frank Keaton, but more commonly known as Buster. Actually from a vaudevillian family. He's born in Kansas, but his family's business was vaudeville theater, a traveling group. And he got into the business in the 1920s. And unfortunately, his career backfired a little bit when he signed up with MGM in the late 1920s. In fact, the studio fired him in 1933. His career was never quite the same, but it's definitely the 1920s is prime Buster Keaton era. And The General was an absolutely stunning picture. It was my first Keaton film. It was not my first silent film. I have seen a little bit of Renoir. I have seen a little bit of Russian cinema of that era. Hitchcock started in silent films after all. So I was familiar. I had wet my toes in silent cinema, but this was a big one. Buster Keaton is a big name, even 100 years later. And I was amazed at how good the production was, at how intricate, elaborate, audacious, dangerous the movie looked. In no shape or form could a film like The General be made today. Maybe I should get to why it was compared with Mad Max Fury Road. The General very loosely tells the story of a young Civil War soldier representing the South, actually. He's played by Buster Keaton. He falls in love with a beautiful belle. The family disapproves, and he actually has to go rescue her. I believe she's kidnapped by soldiers from the North, and he commandeers a train, a military train, nicknamed the General, hence the movie's title. And it is pretty much a chase film. He is chasing the quote enemy, and he needs to make it back at the end of the film, and craziness ensues. The number of stunts in the film are absolutely preposterous. He being Buster Keaton, he was his own stunt person. He actually rides the front of the train to dislodge wooden logs, which were set on the track by the train he is pursuing, because they want to slow him down, they want to derail him, they want to escape Buster Keaton's character. He's on the front of the train. That accident, there could have been an accident, is what I meant to say. It's a remarkable stunt. Of course, the stunt of the picture is when a train crosses a bridge overhead of a lake or a river, actually, but it's bombed and the train falls into the lake. It's a real stunt. They really prepped that train to fall into the river. It's quite something. So I was absolutely flabbergasted by what I watched in The General, and it sent me down this path of discovering more of Buster Keaton's filmography. I haven't watched everything he did, but I did get to see 3 Ages, Sherlock Jr., Battling Buster, The Cameraman. So I've seen about, maybe 5 or 6 of his movies. Some of it a little bit earlier, like 3 Ages. Some of it a little bit later, like The Cameraman, which is 1928. 3 Ages is 1923, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a bit of a 5-year gap between those two. And you can tell that there's definitely an increase in budget between his early stuff and The General and The Cameraman. Cameras are a big thing, hence the title of The Cameraman, where he's trying to work for a newspaper. He wants to be a video documentarian for a media outlet because he's fallen in love with the secretary. A lot of these plots are quite similar. Sherlock Jr., he works in a movie theater. He is the projectionist in a movie theater. So the idea of photography, of film, the physicality of the camera, that's a big thing in his movies, which is interesting because at that time in the 1920s, cinema itself was a relatively new medium. It had been going on for about a decade plus by the mid-1920s, but it was still relatively new. It wasn't necessarily accessible to the wider public, certainly, at least not at the level at which it is today. And there are a lot of common threads, falling in love with the girl, trying to impress the girl, that's a big thing. People around him, characters around whoever he plays, seem to ignore his very existence. Like they'll bump into him, they'll stretch their arms and knock him. He'll be behind a character who's walking through a door frame, and they'll close the door right in his face. Like nobody seems to know Buster Keaton exists in his movies, and that's part of the comedic effect. I guess that vaudevillian background, that theatricality, overly dramatic, and the comedic effect is emphasized through physicality and very exquisitely timed stunt work. However simple or legitimately risky the stunt work is, it's always very, very well timed. He's very stone-faced. He seems to have a glum look on his face, which also adds a bit to the comedic effect of his movies. I was incredibly impressed. my eyes were wide open while watching these movies, and how special effects were handled back then. Three Ages is a fascinating one. It's one of his earlier pictures, and it is about how, you know how I said one of the plots of almost all of his movies is him trying to get the girl. Well, Three Ages is three stories. It's almost like an anthology. The Stone Age, Ancient Rome, and present day. I mean, present day being 1923, circa 1923. And him playing three different characters, gets Three Ages, hence the title, trying to win over girls. And they're actual stop-motion animated dinosaurs in Three Ages. I wasn't expecting that at all. To me, stop motion was a thing of the 1930s, the 1940s, but no, not early 1920s. There's stop motion dinosaurs in this movie. The sets in the ancient Rome, the Colosseum, those are magnificent. There's an actor playing a lion when his character gets imprisoned or kidnapped, really, and sent into the cellars underneath the arena, the Colosseum's arena. There's an actor playing a lion. He or she is in a lion costume, and he and this lion interact. It's a wild movie. Sherlock Jr., one of his better known films, features a sequence where, as Buster Keaton's character is projecting a film in a movie theater, he falls asleep, and a sort of ghost version of himself leaves his body, and this is where the dream begins. He leaves his own body, walks down one of the aisles of the theater room where the patrons are watching the film, and he enters the movie that's being projected. So Sherlock Jr. is a movie within a movie within a movie within a dream. Film. You like Inception? Sherlock Jr. did it first, apparently. To a certain extent. I'm a big fan of Inception. I'm not trying to be snarky, but to an extent, you could argue Sherlock Jr. did it first. Big respect to Buster Keaton. I know he had a bit of a rough marriage. He got divorced, had to remarry. He fell into alcoholism later in his life. He actually has a small role in Sunset Boulevard that he is in that movie. It is in a small bit part. But he was a wonderful performer, a true performer. You know, there's acting, which he is doing to an extent. I know there's performing. He is his own technician. He is his own director, although he did collaborate with other directors. He's his own technician. He's his own writer. He is his own director, and he is his own stunt person. Tom Cruise, eat your heart out. It'd be interesting to know what is Tom Cruise's opinion of Buster Keaton. He must admire him, to an extent at least. I'm sure he's knowing that Tom Cruise is such a big film buff. I'm sure he's aware of Buster Keaton. He must admire him quite a bit. There you have it. I mean, I don't want to go on too long. I feel like I've already been prattling for the past couple of minutes, or since the start of the episode. But I would highly encourage anyone who likes comedy, who likes physical comedy, who likes stunt work, who likes action. You need to check out these Buster Keaton films. I mean, I'm not done. I know Steamboat Willie Jr. is a popular one. I haven't watched that one yet. But I don't think there's a single one I didn't like. Maybe Battling Buster, which is a fun film. I enjoyed it, but it's maybe the least elaborate of his movies. It's maybe a simpler story, and the comedy is more situational than anything else. I think it's a fine movie. I'm not saying overlook Battling Buster, but if you want some what's up stuff you might not anticipate, if you are inclined to not get too excited about old films, black and white films, silent films. They weren't very sophisticated in how they presented action. My guy, you have to check out Three Ages. You have to check out Sherlock Jr. And you definitely have to check out The General. Please, please do. And just as Buster Keaton's techniques, acting style, the action beats speak to the kinds of movies we consume these days and throughout the ages. Think about Jackie Chan film. I mean, Jackie Chan is basically a Chinese Buster Keaton to an extent. Jackie Chan did all of his own stunts. He was his own stunt person. He was his own producer. He had a huge part to play in those movies that he made. The Drunken Masters, the Police Stories, all that jazz. The Rumble and the Bronxes, all of it. Huge role to play. Sometimes silent films speak to our generation and to each other in different ways. Another big filmmaker, albeit a very different one, is Yasujiro Ozu, the Japanese, much lauded Japanese filmmaker. As I was discovering for the first time these Buster Keaton films, I decided to go back to Ozu. Now, I had seen some of his films. I think every film fan has seen Tokyo Story. I am due to rewatch it, though. To be fair, I am due to rewatch it. But I said, well, since I'm watching Keaton's silent era filmography, how about I watch Ozu's silent film filmography? And I watched a handful of his as well, just to see the contrasting styles and perhaps some of the similarities as well. And there are some, those camera pans I find are quite identical. The way the cameras are set up sometimes, how very carefully chosen the camera movements are, and the location of the lens and what is the lens capturing. Because again, this is still the early days of cinema. The filmmaking techniques and the technology, not only the techniques themselves, but I guess more importantly, the tech involved in shooting a film, capturing live action, was very different and not nearly as sophisticated as it would become over the course of multiple decades, leading to today where there are literally feature-length films shot on iPhones, which is bonkers when you think of it. But it wasn't as sophisticated back then. So the careful, deliberate, and calmer camera position is quite interesting. And the camera pans are very interesting as well. Ozu likes his camera pans. He likes to discover and explore and reveal to the audience his camera pans, which is something Hitchcock does quite a bit of in a lot of his movies. Just think about the introduction to Rear Window, where we are discovering what James Stewart's apartment looks like. Is it an apartment or a condo? I can't remember if he rents. I don't remember if he rents or owns. But whatever, the location, that we learn of it, and we learn of his backstory through a camera pan. And Ozu loves his camera pans. Of course, Ozu is much more contemplative than Keaton. He's a bit more deliberate, more cerebral in his storytelling. Whereas Buster Keaton wanted to entertain the audiences with effects, with stunts, with comedy, with romance. Ozu is more he's more concerned with real life's problems. There is some deftness, there's some lightness of touch to a couple of his movies. That's not to say there isn't any, but he's a little bit more cerebral, he's a little bit more contemplative. Movies like Tokyo Chorus, Where Are Now the Dreams of Youth, I Graduated But, I Flunked But. These films, I noticed, have a lot to do with the struggles of the job market, how the difficulties of landing a job might impact friendships, might impact romantic relationships, Maybe, as is the case in Where Are the Dreams of Youth? Where Are Now the Dreams of Youth? It's a bit of a tough title to say. When you actually have a job and you're the big boss, what is your relationship vis-a-vis your old mates who work for you? But now the dynamics differ. So his films are obviously much more serious, but there is some lightheartedness. One of his great silent films is I Was Born But, which is actually a story told from the point of view of two brothers, two very young brothers. They can't be older than maybe 7 or 8 years old, if that, maybe even only 6 or 7. And, one of them's a little bit more demure, the other one's a little bit more rambunctious and bold. And it's their story of playing hooky from school, believing their father to be an all-important person, such a great man, until they discover that their father is no better than, and I don't mean to bemoan this, again, reality, but that their father is no more than just a simple employee, and there is someone more important than him in whatever company he works for. There's a boss. Their father's not the boss. Their father has a boss, and that disappoints them. Suddenly they're ashamed of their father. But of course, these are children. They don't fully understand the world yet. So even in a movie like I Was Born But, which has a relatively heavy comedic slant, I think you can describe that as a comedy. There is still a contemplative nature to it and a cerebral nature to it, and it still functions as a window into commentary on what we think of, how we interpret the world, and how we view sometimes our family members. Only in this case, it's through the prism of two young boys. Whereas stuff like I Graduated But, although it does have some lighter moments, that one's a little bit darker in the sense. Why is it called I Graduated But? Well, it's because the protagonist passes his final exams, but then struggles to find a job. And intermittently throughout the film, he crosses paths with his former schoolmates who are now still in school, and their life is much simpler. They don't have as much to worry about, at least not yet, whereas he does. He doesn't just have to wake up in the morning, go to school, study a little bit, and write some exams. He's actually in the lion's den. The lion's den being the real world. So even though it has lighter moments, it does comment on, not necessarily comment, accepts and explores the reality of the real world. Funnily enough, if you pay close attention to his silent era films, Ozu's that is, there are many, many, many posters, movie posters in the background. And they're almost all exclusively of American films, or at least very popular films, big budget films, backed by American studios, all quite on the Western Front. There's a movie, there's some Joan Crawford posters in there. It's really quite interesting. You can tell that Ozu, even though he doesn't make movies like the Americans do, he definitely loves them. Otherwise, those posters wouldn't be in the background. So I thought that was quite interesting. You can see that there's still a dialogue going on between East and West, even at that time. Cross-cultural connections made through cinema. I thought that was quite an interesting detail as well. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest Ozu films for their excitement, but if you want explorations, honest and sometimes likely comedic explorations of the struggles of everyday life, Ozu is a magnificent filmmaker. There you have it. That was episode 4 of Film Filter. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're listening to this, it's because you already found me, but whatever. For shits and giggles, the YouTube channel is Edgar Chaput 1793. I'm on Facebook. It's just my name, Edgar Chaput. My last name is Chaput, and I'm on Twitter at EdgarChaput1983. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you very soon. Take care, guys. Ciao.